normally do this with a PowerPoint with lots of flashy, what a colleague of mine calls shock and awe graphs that illustrate the power of the digital to reshape how we see the historical archive that we've inherited. Unfortunately, the site was so pretty that I was shamed by my own graphical skills and decided instead just to talk about it. And that prettiness is not a small thing. That prettiness is actually central to one aspect of that broader online issue. Because if you think about it, if you think about the inherited technologies of knowing that we all grew up with, and over 600, 700, 800, 1,000 years have gradually evolved. If you think about the medieval manuscript, the illuminated manuscript and the book, the people who created those knew absolutely how to have an impact, how to use leather and indigo and gold leaf and good quality paper to create a technology, an experience of reading. They did so by making it pretty. They did so by making knowledge an object of desire. And online, we do the same thing. And the only thing I would say about this site is that it absolutely does achieve that objective. It is pretty. And in the process of being pretty, I like it. In the process of being pretty, it also essentially encodes a particular kind of reading and implies a particular and appropriate use. But mainly, it's pretty.
It's not so pretty in this old version of Internet Explorer. So
okay. No, it's still not bad. And okay, that's pretty. Never mind. It always happens. It always happens. Anyway, the other thing I want to say about today is that at this particular moment, we are actually at a really nice point to be launching a major research archive of this sort. It represents a moment in the longer-term history of digitization of our cultural inheritance, or what I tend to describe, and what I'm going to describe through the rest of the next 10, 15 minutes or so, is stuff left to us by dead people. And I do that because I have become increasingly disenchanted with the categories of knowledge that come with inherited culture. But it comes at a great moment because that job of digitizing the print archive, at least up until 1923, when Disney stole all of our culture, is within sight of a rather unsatisfactory end. A lot of this work has been shoddily done to a low standard and conceived within the most reactionary of scholarly practices. But as a historian of 18th century Britain, I can now be certain that pretty much everything published in this country in my period can be accessed from my desk at home. The underlying OCR is complete rubbish. And if you ever look at the OCR that underpins something like the Burney collection, it is shocking. And we have essentially traded the close reading of a few texts, that traditional scholarly process, for a much more problematic keyword search on large numbers of text. And in the process, made essentially undiscoverable a third of all early modern print. But I have to admit that I now go to the British Library to see exhibitions and drink coffee. And I read 18th century print materials online and at home. This launch also comes at a moment when the digital manuscript archive is beginning to grow dramatically in a way that betokens new connections between Transcribe Bentham, the Newton and Darwin projects, the Soane project, between Pauper Lives and London Lives, between the work of the National Archives and the private sector and the Mormons, because although we in the Academy may want to think that we own this stuff, actually there are lots of people playing around with it outside. The proportion of the manuscript archive available for search and discovery is growing dramatically. And while the commercial transcription and posting of manuscripts, and I'm thinking particularly of the censuses, has been done to a poor standard and will cause problems for generations to come, my feeling is that both this project and the other academic projects dedicated to representing manuscript archives online have essentially learned the lessons of the project of digitizing print, that we really need to get it right, that we need to actually capture the material well, that we need to actually pay attention to the traditional values of an archivist and a librarian, and absolutely represent in the kind of detail that we can that inherited body of materials. The Board of Longitude, this site, seems to me to be testimony to the fact that we have actually learned the lessons of print digitization. But this launch also comes at a moment of new maturity for the broader notion of the web overall and how we as scholars engage with it. After 15 years of hard slog, 20 years of hard slog, the great deposit libraries of Britain, led by the British Library, but involving all the other deposit libraries as well, have finally established a system of digital deposit for the whole of the UK web domain. A snapshot of everything on the web is now being archived once every 6 months and will be for as long as the system of national libraries survive. And that actually is a worry. As the systems of recording the world in paper archives gives way to the online and the digital, the memory institutions of this country have made a massive step towards capturing that new online reality. This launch also comes at a moment when we're just beginning to wake to the realization that in digitizing this stuff, we are turning it into something entirely new. We're turning it into data. And in the process, tearing down the walls of division that seem so solid between object and text, between a library and a museum, between an art gallery and a map. By creating new editions of all these apparently different types of things, we are both finding new patterns in these collections of stuff, and just as importantly, throwing into ever sharper focus the epistemologies, the taxonomies that we inherited from the Enlightenment, which said this object went to the National Maritime Museum, while that object went to the British Library, and a third went to the Tate. The point about the process of turning something else into something new, the point about that new edition of our inherited archives is that it actually forces us, allows us to think differently about those apparently natural categories of information that we all grew up with. Our data may not be all that big, but the underlying intellectual imperative driving big data movements in STEM and across the piece in the academy is absolutely relevant to what we're doing here. Because what happens when you create data out of text, out of images, out of materials, is create something that can be explored in a different way from a different perspective. As we learn the lessons of the digitization of the print archive and set about making workable the process of digital deposit, as we figure out how to represent 3D objects online and do justice to audio, video, and manuscript, a few more components of a new system for collecting and organizing the stuff of the dead is gradually falling into place. In other words, we are near that point where the raw materials of a new scholarship are available: print, video, audio, manuscript, and object. And in my estimation, the context into which this site is launched is an online ecology that is beginning to reach a new and different stage. And I should say that Britain and Britain's piles of rotting paper have been at the forefront of this process worldwide. And that ironically, 18th century Britain is the most digitized time and place on the planet, and therefore should actually be the cauldron within which that new scholarship evolves. Can you evolve in a cauldron? I'm not sure you can. All of which is wonderful. It's good. It is an unproblematic good thing in many ways. At the same time, while celebrating this remarkable state of affairs, and it is remarkable, for historians in particular, the last 10 or 15 years have, it seemed to me, been a moment of complete flounder and bemusement. We haven't actually engaged, during which we have largely failed to reconceptualize our scholarship to engage effectively with a rapidly changing object of study. The irony is that archivists and librarians who have been at the front of this charge of digitization have been far ahead of academics and historians in recognizing that a scan of a page is just not the same thing as a physical page, which itself reflects nothing more than a complex encoding of the behavior and thoughts we are really seeking to find. In other words, the digitization of stuff offers both a real opportunity and a substantial challenge to us as scholars. So, to quote my title, I find myself continually asking, what should we do after digitizing the Western archive? And I have an answer. It seems to me that the first thing we need to do is to simply recognize that this is no longer the same object of study we were working on 20 years ago. It is different. What you can do with it is different. How you engage with it is different. How you write with it is different. How you read it is different. The information technology that was a research library, an archive, and museum, and gallery, and map collection has been replaced by a digital representation that makes all the stuff of the dead into data. Now, I've always rather viewed cataloging and preservation of an archive in the light of a kind of taxidermy, in which a once living thing, a fire-breathing paper machine designed to control a bureaucracy, is eviscerated and stuffed and modeled in crude imitation of life. What an archivist wants to do when they're confronted with a new archive is tie it down, describe it, and make sure it doesn't move again. We study it in hope of discovering something about the once living beast, using assumptions drawn from social science and naive positivism to fill in the blanks. But we're all more or less failures at that. All our writings largely reiterate the views of the archivist, who determines what we can find, and the clerk, who constructed the archives in the first instance. At best, we see most clearly through the dead eyes of the clerk. But we are nevertheless largely trapped by them, acting as a ventriloquist dummy for the long dead. And the point about digitizing the archive is that for the first time, we can escape their grasp. We can both know the structures that we've inherited, the archival structures that are so important to reading it, at the same time as we aren't dependent upon those structures in order to navigate our way through it. In other words, I think we should really be working on just a few objectives. And the first is to continue to raise the quality of digitized representation and make sites like this one that reflect the archival structure clearly and intelligently. But I also think we can do better than that. That we can take this kind of archival taxidermy much further than we have up till now. I'm quite keen, for instance, to think more about how to represent the physicality of traditional bureaucracy. The sense that an account book encodes a process in time and space as well as the statement of a moment. We could try to represent, for example, the spike or the string on which every receipt was put, time-stamped in the process of creating an account page. That then, of course, leads to a conclusion at the bottom of the page, which then leads from your day book to your month book to your annual accounts. Those are all time-specific activities, and if that archive is a paper machine, I would really love to find the handle and turn it, to put it into motion, so that when we read it, we don't read it as a dead thing, we read it as a living thing. But second, let's all just take a hammer to it and break it down to 1 billion bits. Each meaningful encoding, whether that's a word, a name, or a scratch mark on a silver teapot, should be findable, linkable, and reusable, analyzable, because the Western archive is data. And because of its data, it is possible to identify the patterns within it that the structures of the archives militate against our being able to see. The clerk's worldview is that of an institution, and each name in his ledger a supplicant to his power. Up until now, we have viewed that world through his dead eyes, and I use his here purposefully, because the gendered character of that authority is at the core. But by breaking his machine, we can reconfigure our perspective from that of the clerk to that of the groups and individuals as they move through the social systems that create the archives themselves. We can both know the systems and still escape from within them. And in the process, we can create a new kind of humanism. And what we can do with people, we can also do with words. Whose language seep through which systems? In 30 years of the linguistic turn, we struggled to do justice to the powerful controlling nature of language and discourse. The digitization of the Western archive allows us to actively test all that and simply map both the boundaries of a discourse and where in all the words of the dead that discourse actually appears. And of course, this project is already doing things like linking objects in museums with text. And I think that is absolutely central to a broader project of breaking down those boundaries of difference that we've inherited. And if we can do this with people and words, we can also do it with things and places. Now, I work on poor people, thieves and beggars and general ne'er-do-wells. And so my interests are not actually very well served by most museums. But if I, for example, was looking at a teapot from Spitalfields in 1780 in the Museum of London, I want to access all the texts in all the places online that are about that teapot or place or that moment. If it was mentioned in a trial account, if somebody stole it, I want to know everybody who was actually in prison with the thief. And then I want to know everything that everybody he was in prison with actually, why do I assume he was a he? She was in prison with, I want to know everything they stole. I want to be able to put the material object into the complex archive of inheritance that up till now has been split and set asunder by our cultural institutions. Digitization allows us to change our point of perspective at will and has the effect of reconfiguring the archive around new points of departure. And it's not difficult. This is all really a technical and architectural issue, whereby the physical institutions of the Enlightenment and the 19th century, which were built on the lines of intellectual divisions that are no longer useful, are all mashed up and made transparent through APIs and on-the-fly linkages, through the rise of open link data, just a bit of intelligent computer science. In a sense, what we've done over the last 20 years is tend to reproduce the things that we inherited from a generation before. The boundary set simply in a Dewey Decimal number, the boundary set in an archive, have all essentially informed what gets digitized, where, how it works, what system is used to digitize it, and all the rest of it. But those are small hurdles by comparison to the long walk from the British Museum to the British Library. And finally, once we've realized that the Western archive is data, we can also begin to address that other weird artifact of the Enlightenment, academic history writing itself, with its monographs and footnotes, which simply mimic the functioning of that old intellectual technology of the library, of the paper library. Academic history writing is both failing to fulfill the requirements of rigorous scholarship, it is misrepresenting the research process. I sit at home and read an 18th century pamphlet online, and yet I cite it as if I'd been sitting in the library. It's paper husk in my hand. It's not true. It's a lie. And I don't think that as reasonable academics, we should allow ourselves the freedom to continue to lie in quite that way. The current open access wars, which I'm sure you've all been following with bated breath, reflect the extent to which we have not fully figured out how to publish online or how to engage with the new possibilities in a way that looks like secondary literature, serves the function of old-style academic history writing. But academic writing is as much a commentary on a body of data as it is a process of independent storytelling. And I'm sure we could have an argument about all the other things it is too. As the archive is digital, I challenge us to all give every reader the ability to follow us into the archive. I don't want to sit there pretending that I'm an authority on the 18th century without actually giving my reader all the access, everything that I've read, to check, to challenge, and to turn themselves into a better authority than I can ever be. I think that we really do need to step back and think harder about how we actually present our evidence in combination with the materials that we actually write. But to conclude, this is a beautiful site, and it does something really important. And if it just makes hyper available the musings of Neville Maskelyne and John Pond, makes more available that story of intellectual change and worldwide impact, that is wonderful. It is, and this is the highest praise I have for anything, it is an unproblematic good thing, and we must praise it. But to my way of thinking, it is also part of a larger and rather wonderful project of reimagining what we can do with the stuff of the dead. Thanks.